So, good evening to all. We will meet this evening with Geoff Corre and Professor Peter Shirlow. Geoff is a trainer and consultant in countering trafficking and modern slavery as an accredited serious case review author. He will introduce Professor Peter Shirlow. And over to you for the presentation. And I will run the presentation when you tell me.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Yes, I think we said, since we last met, I think obviously our attention's been on Eastern Europe with the war in Ukraine. But obviously there are issues here in Northwest Europe as well, including the future of the peace process following Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol. So I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker this evening, Professor Peter Shirlow, Director of the Institute for Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool. Also, I understand visiting research fellow or visiting research professor at the George Michel Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. And also reading your CV, I was very interested to hear that you've interested in applying the lessons learned from the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process to other conflict areas, including Macedonia, the former Yugoslavia, Bahrain and Iraq. So tonight's topic is Northern Ireland and the Protocol. Who's going to protect the ecosystem? Over to you, Pete.
Okay, thank you very much. And if we could start off with the PowerPoint. So basically what I want to argue tonight is the protocol has in many ways destabilized a very important ecosystem that's been created since the Good Friday Agreement. And if you put up the slides, please. Yeah. So the first one. Okay. So basically, as people understand, Belfast and Northern Ireland went through a very pernicious and difficult conflict from 1968 to 1998, and paralleling that was, of course, the question of deindustrialization, and also then what happens in the early 1990s is the opening up of borders across Europe, and that in many ways helped the peace process, because it was the period in which we also had the paramilitary ceasefires at the beginning of the peace talks. And what we started to see was, greater movement of goods. And in particular, for those who wish for United Ireland, who live in Northern Ireland, nationalists and Republicans, an invisible border or a low friction border actually in many ways created this sense that Northern Ireland was part of Ireland. And you could symbolically play the sense that the island was united, although not constitutionally, but was increasingly united through economics, and of course the Good Friday Agreement through politics. So in many ways, open borders on the island were part of the solution of trying to change the nature of constitutional identity. And I suppose in some ways, for civic nationalists, it was a close enough thing to constitutional change that allowed them to feel their Irishness was being protected. So Belfast was a very different world there. It felt different. It was a place which lacked nightlife. The city centre was largely closed. A quarter of the city was bombed during the Troubles, and of course, most people were simply getting through the day. There was always a spirit within the people. They responded to the conflict. They got on with their lives, but of course, much of what was happening around them was beyond their control. So in many ways, violence had actually subverted and twisted aspiration in Northern Ireland. People would invest in Northern Ireland. It became very dependent upon the public sector, and you had a drift of younger people who took their social capital elsewhere because of the lack of opportunities. And of course, what we have today is this new civil and civic society that has emerged post 1998, and we've got this new city, that's working in opposite direction. Ferocity is for change, and it's a place in which extremism is for a world that's better and different. So Belfast has become, for example, the main centre for fintech development and investment outside of America by American companies. The city is a world leader in cybersecurity, and it's also a major centre now of cultural production and also legal services. So one of the things the Good Friday Agreement actually did was it actually created this ecosystem And within that ecosystem, we not only had improved economic situation and massive declines in unemployment, growth in employment, growth in skilled work, etc. What we also had was, with the removal of violence, a growth in mixed identity relationships, more people mixing across the sectarian divide, and the sort of growth in this sense that conflict had been settled and society was normalizing. And then, of course, along comes Brexit. And what Brexit does, of course, is it very much destabilized that ecosystem, and then the various ideologies that are involved in the protocol, etc., have in many ways brought back street politics, has brought back, refusal of the DUP to engage in the assembly, and also with the Tory party has led to this wider ideological game with Europe. And the consequences of that for Northern Ireland are quite damaging. It reduces a desire to invest in Northern Ireland because nobody knows what the outcome is. With the protocol, clearly you have the best of both worlds: access to the European market, the single market, access to the UK market. Nobody has grasped that, because nationalists see Brexit as an opportunity to drive the constitutional debate, and unionists have, of course, seen Brexit and the protocol as a delinking and decoupling with Great Britain, and therefore undermining the constitutional position, given the goods are checked coming, as we would say, east-west from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. So we go on to the next slide. So we've come from this sort of situation. This is a pub in Belfast, the Duke of York. We've got to realize the intensity of that conflict. 3,600 people died, 30,000 people went to prison, and we also had 50,000 serious injuries. If that was the population of Great Britain, that would be the equivalent to 1.5 million seriously injured people. So this was a very intimate and a very profound conflict upon Northern Irish society. And if you roll forward to the next slide, this is the same place today. It's lively. It's a major consumer centre. It's got high-tech industry, and as you can see, you have swarms of crowds. And Belfast has become a major tourist site in recent years, and also a place in which people are now moving to work. So that, in many ways, is the ecosystem. That's what has been created. That is what has been really important in terms of understanding where Northern Ireland came to be 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement. So we'll go on to the next slide. So just to give you an idea of the impact of 1998 and elsewhere, you can see the vast bulk of violence was in the 1970s. These are conflict-related deaths in Northern Ireland. And you can see that over time that has been a decline. And of course, since 1998, the levels of violence have declined to being nearly negligible. So that has been an ecosystem in itself. You don't have violence, you have less suspicion between communities, you have more trust between communities, and you take away that sort of sectarianization, which in many ways affected society in Northern Ireland. Go to the next slide, please. Firearms fine, you see the same trend. It's not just the deaths have declined in Northern Ireland, but also has the seizure of arms by the police. Go to the next slide. So this illustrates the point very clearly. These are kilograms of explosives that were seized by the security forces in Northern Ireland. 1972, the police in Northern Ireland seized 20,000 kilograms of explosives. This is now down to about 1 kilogram a year. So as you can see, the evidence points very clearly in the direction of a changed society, and with the sociological and societal impacts that change has had, is illustrated by the growth in mixed relationships, more people socializing across the sectarian divide, more people working together across the sectarian divide, and of course, non-violence has now become something which is quite normalized and something which we obviously want to protect. The next slide, please. Yeah. And of course, just to reinforce that point, you can see the very significant decline. So this is what I mean by the ecosystem. By reducing violence, you've created a completely different socio-economic, political, cultural environment, which of course it has its tensions and its problems. But what has also happened is people say that Brexit has caused difficulties. Of course, it's caused tensions, but it hasn't created the types of violence and patterns of violence that we had before. So that's important. It's a political crisis more than an inter-community violent crisis, and that's something to be thankful for. Okay. Thank you. Next slide. Sectarian crime, first recorded in 2005, has declined by 62%. So there's something here that's worth protecting, the Good Friday Agreement, the positive impacts of the Good Friday Agreement. This is something we need to protect. And what we hear from those who are involved in protocol and Brexit is this constant reference that they're protecting the Good Friday Agreement, but they never explain what they're protecting. And one of the fundamental problems with the protocol, of course, is that issue about east-west movement of goods. That goods are checked coming into Northern Ireland. Clearly, for political party unionism, that is a dilution of Northern Ireland's place within the union. Why are goods being checked when they are moving from the GB into Northern Ireland and staying within the UK? Why is Europe being so insistent upon these checks and upon these rules, etc.? Of course, the opposite argument is the single market can only operate in a certain way. It has rules and regulations, and those rules and regulations need to be applied. So in many ways, there's an ideological problem in that those issues have no obvious resolution, because with the Tory party's Brexit bill or protocol bill, we've seen that already being articulated as this is the offer for negotiations. Negotiations have to come to the point of delivering what's in the protocol bill. And of course, that's not a point to start a negotiation. For example, the Good Friday Agreement, which created all of these wonderful things in Northern Ireland, did not start off with preconditions. It started off with conversations about what could be achieved, how could it be achieved, and it formulated its way into a document. Whereas at the minute we have this, I assume, with regard to the Tory party, it's not really about the protocol. It's about the overall ideological issue about Brexit. And I suppose Northern Ireland can be quite embarrassing in a way, because Northern Irish trade has recovered quite well over COVID. And part of the reason for that recovery is Northern Ireland is in the single market. Part of the reason why GB hasn't recovered as well is because it's not in the single market. So there's all sorts of ideological games and twists and turns within all of this. So let's now move on to the new society, and that's the context of how violence changed in our society. And now we'll move on to the next slide. So here's an example of what's happened. So gross value added, the contribution of NUTS 3 regions in the UK. So there are 179 NUTS 3 regions. And as I said, Belfast, the city in which a quarter of its retail space was bombed during the Troubles, is now the 7th highest performer for GVA in the UK. That is a phenomenal change in fortunes. And as you can see there, the only 6 places that are above Belfast are all basically London or the Greater London area, the southeast of England. Belfast is the best performing NUTS 3 region economy out of 179 in the UK, and that means it's the best outside of the southeast of England in that context. That has come about because of the peace process. The peace process drove investment. The peace process drove skills and the upgrading of skills. The peace process created a major tourist economy. That's the ecosystem. That's what ending violence created. That's what some level of political stability created, was that staggering performance in terms of Belfast's economy and its contribution to the national economy. Okay, next. So it's become this incredibly important place. So all these multinational companies, I'm sure you've heard of them, you know about them. So you've got a whole mixture there: software engineering, aircraft industry, fintech companies, law companies, and 75% of new 75% of new investors reinvest in Northern Ireland. And as I said previously, during the conflict, you couldn't get people to invest in Northern Ireland. You couldn't get people to take the risk of investing in a war zone. So this is what I mean by this changing society. Okay, next, please. So you have all of these other things, FDI markets. Entrepreneurs in Northern Ireland are the most likely to reach $1 million turnover within 3 years. Belfast is ranked 5th best medium-sized European city of the future and 3rd for economic potential. So this reinforces the point that what the protocol would have done is added another layer of competitiveness and attractiveness to the Northern Irish economy. One of the problems with the Northern Irish economy is its successes are largely located in Belfast, less so in Derry, and less so in other parts of Northern Ireland. So in many ways, the protocol, with the best of both worlds access to two markets, could have been a dynamic to get more growth and more investment outside of Belfast and into other areas. This would have been game-changing. This would have been the peace dividend. And as I say, no political party in Northern Ireland champions that as a reality. Unionists won't say it because they're against the protocol, and nationalists won't say it because it would mean Northern Ireland would work. You've always got to remember, when you look at the Northern Irish context, constitutional politics is not far away. It may submerge at times, it may recede at times, but it always comes back with force and vigor at some point. Okay, next, please. So this just tells you a little bit about, this city that nobody went to. And you can see we now have over 1.9 million overnight stays in Belfast, and that's a growth of 91% since 2011. So this is another example of the attractiveness of the city. And these are the things that we really need to protect. Okay, next, please. And with these tourists also come significant, nearly, in this case, 417 million is the value of overnight stays in Belfast. So this is mood changing. It creates tourists. It creates a vibe about the city. And of course, if we went back to violence, or if we have continued political instability, such as now the suspension of the assembly, all of this is at risk. All of this is at risk if we don't have some resolution of the protocol. This will slow down. If the assembly is not there, you can't invest, etc. So just to cap this off, we've been doing a series of surveys since October 2021. And in those surveys, what we have done is we have tested issues about the protocol. What do people in Northern Ireland think about the protocol? And so first of all, 75% of respondents believe the issues are complex and difficult to understand. People don't understand what the protocol is about. People have come out in the streets, we've had riots, we've had a suspension of the assembly, but the majority of people in Northern Ireland don't really know what the issues are. Okay. 79% of unionists, those who wish to remain in Northern Ireland, said that the tax and spending policies should be the same as Great Britain. This is part of the protocol bill. So we were testing the protocol bill and what the attitude was. So unionists want that because they're much more linked to Great Britain, whereas nationalists and leaders, we have about a near equal size now of people in Northern Ireland who don't call themselves unionists and nationalists, who actually are the group that is most pro-EU. Are those who are usually socially liberal and younger and educated. 90% of unionists, compared to the majority, 69% of nationalists, and 74% of leaders, support the UK government's proposal that Northern Ireland should receive the same VAT cuts in energy saving materials as Great Britain. So there's a high level of support in Northern Ireland for some of the aspects of what are in the protocol bill. This will be the British government controlling the market, controlling investment and public spending. Okay. And finally, across all respondents, there are high level support for the UK government proposal that Northern Ireland should receive the same COVID recovery as Great Britain. So this is all wrapped up in what we understand as the British proposal, the British government's proposal, with some variants, but generally high levels of support for that. Okay. Next, please. And of course, despite people saying that they find the protocol difficult to understand, and what we also find is this really big difference that the EU's position that renegotiating the protocol would lead to prolonged legal uncertainty and instability, divides strongly along identity lines, with national support of 71% and look at the unionist support 28%. So what we have within Northern Irish society is, if we put forward proposals from the British, unionists are more likely to support them, although you can sometimes find national support. When you put forward the EU position, the renegotiation will create legal uncertainty. You get a very clear divide across the two identities within Northern Ireland. However, when asked if the UK government was correct in introducing legislation to address the protocol, of course, 80% of unionists agreed, but in around 46% of nationalists and 49% of leaders also showed support. So there is a mood that the protocol has to be resolved, and that is We're not getting majority support outside of unionism, but we are getting relatively significant support. High-level respondents agree that goods coming from Great Britain to the rest of the world should not be checked if destined only for Northern Ireland. So this is the red-green channel type proposal that came from the Tories. So 75% of unionists and 60% of the other two groups agree that goods coming from GB that were only going to Northern Ireland should not be checked. The first survey we did, and I know this is a little bit fantasy word, but the first survey we did, the majority of all three communities did not want checks on goods north, south, or east, west. They didn't want checks on goods coming from Northern Ireland to Republic and vice versa, and they did not want checks on goods coming from Britain to Northern Ireland to Britain. So there's always been a sense that people didn't want this, although they will have slightly different perspectives within that. Goods coming from GB and the rest of the world should not have to comply with EU rules. Yet again, looking at the Tory idea, and of course you see that again, 76% of unionists and approximately 55% of both DASs and EATers agree with that. So, you know, it might be a fantasy word, it might be that we have to have certain rules and regulations, but what's very clear in all of this is people really aren't comfortable with checks and goods. They don't like that Brexit and the protocol has changed the relationship that existed beforehand. They might dislike it slightly less across the identities, but nonetheless, they do dislike it. Now, this is really important point before we go on to the next point. It is nonsense that this is simply a unionist and nationalist issue. Because when you get beyond the political rhetoric and you do these surveys, as you're probably picking up here, there is slightly more consensus than you would assume. And if we go to the next group of data, you'll see that even more clearly. Okay, so only 55% respondents believe that goods from GB or the rest of the world that in Northern Ireland from the Republic of Ireland should be checked in Northern Ireland to ensure they meet EU regulations. 64% of NASAs and 26% of users agree that the European Court of Justice is the correct place. Yet again, you're picking up that NASAs are more pro-EU than unionists. And you're getting something slightly similar. Protocols should be ensured, 51% of unionists, 50% of NASAs, which were the creation of an independent arbiter. So look at that, that's really interesting. So should we have the European Court of Justice? 64% nationalists, 26% unionists. But should we have something that's independent? You get consensus between the two main communities, okay? And I think that's interesting. You know, the people here are used to the Good Friday Agreement. They're used to this idea about negotiation. And they do know. Now, there's lots of stories in the media about empty shells, which is largely due to COVID, etc. But there is a sense within Northern Irish society that the protocol is driving up prices. Whether that's accurate or not, I don't know. But one of the things we had in Northern Ireland, which was actually very interesting, was the Nationalist Party and the Alliance Party started off with the protocol must be implemented. As it's gone on, their mood has changed to the protocol must be amended. The unionist position has always been it's unacceptable if it has constitutional implications. Okay. 70% of respondents believe access to both EU and UK market is vital to the economy of Northern Ireland. So people understand this as well. So people understand that access to both markets is essential to the economy of Northern Ireland. They understand that. And as a statement, this is the bit that's actually really interesting. Should these tensions be resolved by negotiation, you're getting the majority of all three communities. So you're not getting what you're being told by unionists, which is complete rejection. You're not getting what you're being told by the Tory party is this bill or nothing else. What you actually find amongst the people of Northern Ireland is that they want this to be sorted. They want this to be negotiated. They want leadership here. And what's also interesting when we did a survey before this, at the time that Europe started the mitigations, so medicines, you know, that would flow freely, that got nearly 90% support amongst all communities. The arrangements around SPS checks, veterinary checks, movement of meat, etc., the mitigations made by the EU had mass support across all of these communities. So mitigations are actually very popular. In the political rhetoric of Northern Ireland, we're told by unionists that mitigations are not acceptable. It has to be something much greater than that. So in many ways, there's a disjuncture between the mood of people who live in Northern Ireland and what they want to see resolved, and the political rhetoric, which says something very different. So I hope that's a quick run through of the data and the issues and where Northern Ireland is today. And hopefully that's very helpful to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Pete. That was very, very interesting, especially the survey results were absolutely fascinating. As he said, so quite a discrepancy between popular opinion and what the rhetoric of the politicians on all sides. It's really, really fascinating. So could I please open up for any questions? Neil. Right.
To what extent have social attitudes changed in the Republic?
Oh, you're on mute.
There has been actually something which is not within all sections of Irish society, but there has been a little bit of anti-Britishness that has risen, and very much that's driven by the behaviour of the Conservative Party, and that they left Europe, and that they're being unreasonable, and that the protocol bill and all of that has really sort of driven that sense of perfidious Albion. It's not behaving in a reasonable way. It's that gung-ho colonial sort of attitude that you have. Not that I'm saying that's true, I'm just saying what the perception is. And what it's really had, Neil, is a very deleterious effect upon British-Irish relationships, which prior to Brexit could not have been better. And it has created this sort of contestation over Northern Ireland, what's best for Northern Ireland, and how to proceed regarding Northern Ireland. So I think that's one thing we've definitely observed. I think the other thing we've observed, however, is in civic society. You know, the protocol has reminded people about the importance of North-South trade and North-South development, and very much the Taoiseach's initiative, the Shared Island initiative, about trying to build relationships, economic, social, reconciliatory, cultural relationships across the island, has in many ways buffered some of the impacts of Brexit, etc. And I suppose what it's also done is actually put the Irish government, which is quite benign about the constitutional question. You know, our Irish governments have never gone near the constitutional question. It's the old story, you know, what's in the planning, you know, what's in the filing cabinet in the Taoiseach's office concerning Irish unification? Nothing. And of course, what Brexit has done has actually driven a group of civic nationalist groups who are now demanding that, you know, Brexit is a denial of rights. Brexit undermines the Good Friday Agreement, and you'll increasingly see pressure on the Irish government to be more vociferous in their nationalism.
Thanks very much for that response. Any other questions, please?
Oh, if no one else has got anything to add, could I just ask you this, Peter? Your response was about political attitudes. Has there been a change in social attitudes? For example, attitudes towards the Catholic Church in the Republic, attitudes towards outsiders and foreigners.
Yeah.
Do you think there has been a change?
Well, massive changes long-term with regard to the power and authority of the church. And one of the big contestations now is over the fact that the Catholic Church owns so many schools and hospitals, publicly resourced institutions of the state. And you know, the issue about the passing of the abortion amendments is creating, where Catholic churches own the land or own the hospital and basically say abortions aren't going to happen. There's been a massive decline, first of all, in confession, rates of confession, and now rates of attendance, where very few people are engaging in the way they once did. So, you know, that's something which has changed quite dramatically in Southern Irish society. About 19% of the labour workforce in Ireland, Southern Ireland, is immigrants. And what you actually see in the Eurostat data is Ireland's one of the worst societies now for racism. It was the third worst, measured about 3 or 4 years ago, with regard to the question, a person of African descent, had they received abuse in the previous year? and it was the third worst, I think, behind Latvia and Luxembourg. So there are forces like that which are also starting to shape Irish society, and you know, it's also what you really have now in Irish society is that growth of individualism, consumerism, and you can see that growth for Sinn Féin, which is based on you know, an economy which can't house its people, an economy which can't provide access to younger generations, the overheating of the Dublin economy. So there are actually a lot of, for a society that never had, you know, didn't have a rise of fascism or socialism, for a society which after its civil war was relatively stable, you can see that the economy and the neoliberal model that they have, in particular in Ireland, is starting to create social dissent.
Is it possible to argue it the other way as well? I mean, you referred to neithers or neithers, people who didn't identify either as unionists or nationalists, but younger people increasingly rejecting those labels and seeing things differently.
Yeah, of course they are, and that's the process of secularization is one aspect of that. The other is, you know, people mix in ways they didn't do before. If you grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, you pretty much stayed with your own community. That was safety, that was security. And of course, they're the same as anywhere else. There's global influences around sexuality, women's bodily autonomy, and there, you know, what you also have in that younger generation is less fixation upon the past, upon the Troubles, upon legacy, upon all of those things that were the core bread and butter frictions in Northern Irish society. It doesn't mean there aren't young people who are nationalists or unionists, but increasingly there's a sense of that's something that's irrelevant to me. I'm not driven by identity politics. And, you know, it's very much actually sort of very Northern Irish identity. It's a sort of halfway house between Britishness and Irishness. And people are increasingly, especially younger people, are comfortable. And of course, what we know about this younger generation that doesn't vote. And if it does vote, it's very likely to vote Alliance Party. And that non-constitutional type politics would be something that would be important to them. But it's not anything that's been shaped really politically. It's just a sort of a lifestyle. I want to stay out of this fight about protocol, the past, etc. And I wish to remove myself really from society, which is quite depressing in a way, because there's a catalyst within that neither, which could actually shape Northern Irish society's future very, very coherently.
Oh, thanks for that. That's very interesting. But isn't it possible that could lead eventually to United Ireland with the demographic, that coupled with the demographic changes?
Yeah, there's the surveys we're doing is there has been a small growth in support for Irish unity, but it's still sitting around 30%. And if you actually ask questions about paying for the health, you know, because in the South you have to pay for your healthcare, etc. Mm-hmm. If you ask questions about taxation, etc., it falls lower. So although there's a more, you know, like the political parties that support Irish unity, Sinn Féin and the SDLP, have exactly the same share of the vote today as they had in 1998. There's been no clamouring because of that growth in leaders, Geoff. The growth has actually been in the centre. Mm-hmm. Growth has been in the non-constitutional politics of Northern Ireland, as opposed to unionism's decline, nationalism has stayed still. And the demographic shifts are very small. 2 censuses in a row, Catholic population is growing by about 1.2%. It is now slightly larger than Protestantism, but Protestants are more likely to say they're not religious. So they're more likely to be secular, okay? And that secularization started with the Protestant community before the Catholic community. And plus, Geoff, the other thing is in our census, people say they're Catholics and Protestants. They don't know where Catholic or Protestant and the man on the moon. It's an identity term. It's not a religious term. So what we still have is a significant share of people who call themselves Catholics who support staying in the Union. So I would say you'd be looking at least 20 years before you even got close to constitutional change, which goes back to the whole protocol issue, Geoff. If the protocol was to drive a new economy, that could mean two things constitutionally. One, you don't need unity because the place is doing well, or two, the place is now fit for unity. In the surveys, some of the strongest support for unity is in the Republic of Ireland. Some of the strongest reservations are in the Republic of Ireland when you factor in paying for it.
Yeah. So it's quite a complex picture. It's not
much more.
It's not as the politicians were, are portraying it.
No, not at all. It's much more complex, nuanced, layered. Violence has changed people's attitudes in many ways. It's opened up new relationships. Investment changes things. People don't emigrate, people come back, and that's what we're trying to protect here. And if we don't get a resolution to the protocol and the assembly stays down, that's going to create crises economically, socially, public sector spending. It's going to be a crisis. And I don't see at the minute how. I don't see at the minute, unless the British government is going to accept less. I don't see how we get out of this, because Europe has stretched itself. I'm sure it could stretch itself a bit more, but I think that's an important point. I don't see, if the British government is going to play gung ho here, then we're not going to have a return of the assembly, and we're going to have increasing stalemate and crisis in Northern Ireland.
Doesn't that also depend not just on the British government, but on the unionist parties?
Yeah, they're quite adamant about this, and the DUP's electoral fortunes declined because the TUV, a more right-wing unionist party, or a more conservative unionist party, did quite well in the elections. It sort of roughly doubled its vote to about 7%, and it was the not an edge, no negotiation with Europe, scrap the protocol, and all of that. So, DUP's fortunes are very reliant upon a section of unionism which does not want anything but the protocol to be scrapped.
Thanks very much for that. Are there any further questions? In that case, it just leaves me to say thank you once again. Thank you very much, Pete, for really interesting and comprehensive presentation. And hopefully we'll have you back to give us an update at some stage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Piotr, do you want to conclude the proceedings?
Yes, thanks a lot. Peter, well, it's the first time with us on this forum, and hopefully we'll see you again. As the Irish problem and the Northern Irish problem progresses, and the negotiations with Europe, or lack of negotiations with Europe, evolves, particularly with the current British government, we certainly will need updating and following the situation, because of course we have the problem in Ukraine and in the eastern of Europe, but what's going on in the rest of Europe is also very important. So thank you very much for this update, and thanks, Geoff, for organizing this, and good night to all. Thank you, and see you soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Good night all.